Hello and welcome back, friends. I'm Buddy here at Haas of Props. One of my first videos on this channel was Leia's blaster from A New Hope, and a few years ago I made Han Solo's DL-44. So I thought it was about time to complete the blaster Trinity, and that's why in this video I will be making Luke Skywalker's blaster from The Empire Strikes Back. We get to see Luke carry this through the film, and it's nicely featured while he's on Dagobah. It is a DL-44 like Han's, but there are some varying features between the two. The scopes are different, as well as the scope attachments, plus Han has a perforated flash hider, and Luke's is solid, and the greeblies vary between the two. This is the DL-44 Han carries in A New Hope, but in The Empire Strikes Back he switches to one very similar to the one Luke carries. So without any more intro, let's head to the studio and let's get started. Once all the pieces were printed, it was time to do some cleanup on them before attaching them. I began with some 120 grit sandpaper and sand the surface of each piece to remove the visible print layers. For this project, we don't need to worry about removing all of them. In fact, if some of them are still visible, it's actually a good thing because it will help the blaster look like machined metal. When objects are printed with supports, the edge with the supports is roughly textured, and since this area won't be visible when assembled, I use my Dremel and sanding drum to even out the surface so the piece will sit flat. I have the Dremel set on low, like around a 3, because if it's too high, like an 8 or higher, it'll melt the plastic instead of removing it. This area on the flash hider has been sanded with the 120, and I'm about to sand it with some 220. The reason I'm showing you this test area is so you'll see the difference sanding gives you. Some people don't want to sand because they're afraid it'll cause the pieces to warp, but if you use enough infill and sand carefully by hand, warping won't be an issue. You can see how the print layer lines are extremely knocked back from where they started. Now I'm going to repeat the same process with some 400 grit. This will now begin to remove the lines created by the previous sanding steps and smooth the surface to the touch. While I sand, I would really appreciate it if you would click the subscribe button if you haven't already. It's completely free to you and will help my channel grow. Plus, if you click the notification bell, you can customize your notifications so you'll never miss a blaster or a build. Thank you. It's a little difficult to see on camera, but you can definitely feel the difference between the 220 and the 400. Now, comparing an unsanded piece with the sample, you can see how the layer lines have practically disappeared. So I'm going to go ahead and sand the rest of the pieces. With the pieces magically sanded off camera, it's time to assemble. For my glues, I'll be using CA glue and E6000. I'll start with the E6000 and squeeze some onto the piece. I like to use a combination of the two glues because the E6000 is better as a shock resistor glue because it's flexible. But it takes longer to cure. The CA glue will cure quickly, allowing assembly to happen faster, which is why I apply a bead of it around the edges. Once I have the pieces aligned the way I want, I'll use a couple of drops of Zip Kicker to cure the CA glue instantly, which allows me to then attach the next piece without having to wait. The top part of the blaster is glued on, and the barrel can be inserted and glued into the channel. The barrel has two different rounded ends. The end with more of a bevel sits into the blaster, and the flatter end sticks out. It's on this flatter end that the nozzle and the flash hider is attached. The hammer is attached to the rear, and the sight is attached to the top like so. Next comes the scope attachment. The cones on the rear of the piece sit into the recesses on the right side of the blaster body. Then the cone slips onto the vertical supports like this. It seems a little counterintuitive for the larger end of the scope to be facing the rear and the smaller opening facing forward, but that's how it is in the film, so we'll stick to that. Now, with it all attached, it's time to seal and prime the plastic. To seal it and help fill in any unevenness in the sanding, I'm applying a mixture of this glazing and spot putty with acetone to the surface. For this project, I'm using an old paintbrush to apply, but you could use an old airbrush as well. Evenness in the application isn't necessary here, you just want to make sure to cover the entire blaster. This is what mine's looking like, and it's still drying, so I'll let it sit for an hour and come back and see how it's doing. After that hour, we're looking pretty good and dry, so now the putty can be smoothed with the 400 grit sandpaper. This will make a mess, which is why I put down a scrap piece of paper, and the dust is toxic, so wear a mask and keep it away from pets and children. Okay, so the putty is all sanded and smooth. Now it's time to prime the blaster. I'm using this trustworthy filler and sandable primer. It'll help fill in any unevenness and provide a nice primer layer for paint adhesion. To spray, I hang up the blaster and spray a decently heavy layer. If you end up with some drips and runs with this stuff, it doesn't really matter, it can be sanded away. And once I had the blaster coated, I let it sit for 30 minutes before giving it a second coat. Then I let that sit for a minimum of 4 hours, and it's looking like this. So to even it out just a little more, I lightly sand the primer with the 400 grit. This primer stage is where you can really see how even and smooth your surface is, and where the spots are that need a little more attention. Now it's time to begin painting, and for my base layer I'm using a satin black spray paint. This I apply by spraying thin layers. This paint will drip and run, and it's harder to get rid of those in the end, so I build up coverage by applying light layer on light layer on light layer, so basically 3 layers in total, and I let each layer sit for 30 minutes before spraying the next. Once the black is completely dry, the grip can be painted with a mixture of burnt umber and black acrylics. I'm using a soft bristle round brush, and the grip is meant to be a wood, so if any brush marks are left behind, they will aid in the illusion of a wood grain. The blaster can be taped off so only the nozzle is exposed. This I will spray with a dusting of a metallic silver. By dusting, I mean I'm holding the can 12 to 18 inches away and lightly press the plunger. The paint will disperse and lightly settle onto the exposed surface. I didn't want complete coverage, which is why I dusted, and once that's dry, I begin the weathering by brushing on some black acrylic in spots. This will add some carbon scoring to the end and help the piece not look so new and shiny. I apply the burnt umber and black mixture with the same technique. This adds variation to the previous step and makes it a little more aesthetically pleasing by creating visual depth in the aging. To add some aging to the satin black, I brush on some metallic brass. I'm trying to catch the high spots where the blaster would naturally be rubbed, dinged, and nicked, so the black paint would be damaged, exposing the metal underneath. So I try to keep the brush marks and paint intensity random and sporadic. Once all the paint is dry, I want to protect the paint layers, so I lightly spray it with some flat clear coat. In my case, I'm using Kamar varnish, but you can use any you would like. The last step is to add the lenses to the scope. I cut mine out of a plastic container I got from the dollar store and glued them into their correct openings with a tiny bit of CA glue. And like that, Luke's DL-44 is complete. Nothing too overly complicated here. You can see how by not sanding as much as I normally do, it leaves the surface with a pleasing texture, reminiscent of the actual props used for the film. And by keeping the grip in flat acrylics, adding the brass weathering to the body, and adding the scoring to the nozzle and flash hider, it creates a finish that gives the prop a visual history, so it doesn't look like it's fresh off the factory line. Well, that's it for today, friends. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to build one of these, I've put a link to the files in the description. Again, I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, be sure to hit the thumbs up, share this video with all your friends and family, subscribe if you haven't, and I'll catch you on the next one. Have a great day. And remember, if you are building any of my builds or using any of my templates, feel free and tag me at Haas of Props on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok, because I would really like to see your fantastic work. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.